Shalom, shalom, friends. Welcome to this episode here of the Watchdog. I hope you guys are all having a excellent day or evening or night if you're watching this live, wherever you happen to be, whenever you happen to be watching it. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I am your host, CJ Cox, and we have got some interesting things to be discussing for you tonight. So basically, we're going to be reading a couple of government documents today. We're going to read the United Nations Treaty of Non-Proliferation, of nuclear weapons. And we are also going to, if we have the time, read the joint statement of the United States, Sudan, and Israel. And we are also, if we have the time, going to actually get a little bit into the recent riots in Philly. Because we don't want to just do nothing but Middle East news, right? We want to try and get some local news here as well. Obviously, I wouldn't be so far behind if it wasn't for the fact that I hadn't done these for like 3 weeks, but nonetheless, we'll go ahead and press forward. Thank you guys again very much for tuning in. Please do like this and share this to your friends so that we can get people into the stream today. And real quick, before I jump in, I just want to let you guys know if you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, there is a link there rolling across the bottom on the banner there, right? So let's get right into this. Don't really want to go and do any sort of a pre-article discussion because we got a lot to talk about here today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're going to talk about the Non-Proliferation Treaty first. So we talked a little bit about this on Monday, right? The United Nations plans on having, in effect and full force, a non-proliferation treaty on nuclear weapons come January of 2021. Now, of course, how exactly they plan to enforce this treaty, we don't exactly have any information that indicates that, right? At least yet. But nonetheless, there has been over 50 nations who have signed this agreement. It is an agreement to denuclearize and ban nuclear weapons, of course. And they want it to go into force by January of next year, which, of course, is only 2 months from now. Right? That may sound like it's far off in the future, but it certainly is not. It is only 2 months from the current point that we are in, right? That's not long. That's not long at all. So, and 2 months in like a week, because I guess technically it's not the end of October yet. But nonetheless, you guys see, right? This is something that they plan on having in effect soon. At least for the nations who signed on to it. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and read the entire text of the treaty today so that you guys have a better understanding of what exactly this document says, what it means, what exactly it's going to entail for the nations that sign it, and how it affects your own life, if it at all does. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this real quick before we start reading. That should be good enough. Alrighty, and so let's just go ahead and jump right into this. The Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, and this is from the United Nations website, un.org, that we will be reading the text of this treaty. By the way, links to all articles will be in the description. They are not here yet. I'm terrible at actually putting them in the description before I go live, but after I go live, I will make sure to get those links into the description there. The states concluding this treaty, hereinafter referred to as the parties to the treaty, considering the devastation that would be visited upon all mankind by a nuclear war and the consequent need to make every effort to avert the danger of such a war and to take measures to safeguard the security of peoples. Believing that the proliferation of nuclear weapons would seriously enhance the danger of nuclear war. In conformity with resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly calling for the conclusion of an agreement on the prevention of wider discrimination or dissemination. Let me just restart that whole sentence. In conformity with resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly, calling for the conclusion of an agreement on the prevention of wider dissemination of nuclear weapons, undertaking to cooperate in facilitating the application of International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards on peaceful nuclear activities, expressing their support for research, development, and other efforts to further the application within the framework of the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguard system of the principle of safeguarding effectively the flow of source and special fissionable materials by use of instruments and other techniques at certain strategic points. I'm going to read that one more time just because the way I emphasize certain words and sentences might have made it a little bit confusing. Expressing their support for research, development, and other efforts to further the application within the framework of the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguard system of the principle of safeguarding effectively the flow of source and special fissionable materials by use of instruments and other techniques at certain strategic points. Affirming the principle that the benefits of peaceful applications of nuclear technology, including any technological byproducts which may be derived by nuclear weapon states from the development of nuclear explosive devices, should be available for peaceful purposes to all parties to the treaty, whether nuclear weapon or non-nuclear weapon states. Convinced that, in furtherance of this principle, all parties to the treaty are entitled to participate in the fullest possible exchange of scientific information for and to contribute alone or in cooperation with states to the further development of the application of atomic energy for peaceful purposes. Just one moment, I'm going to catch a drink here real quick. Declaring their intention to achieve at the earliest possible date the cessation of the nuclear arms race and to undertake effective measures in the direction of nuclear disarmament, urging the cooperation of all states in the attainment of this objective, recalling the determination expressed by the parties to the 1963 agreement banning nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space and underwater in its preamble, to seek to achieve the discontinuance of all test explosions of nuclear weapons for all time and to continue negotiations to this end. Desiring to further the easing of international tensions and the strengthening of trust between states in order to facilitate the cessation of the manufacture of nuclear weapons, the liquidation of all their existing stockpiles, and the elimination from national arsenals of nuclear weapons and the means of their delivery pursuant to a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. Let's emphasize that last part again real quick. Under strict and effective international control. So in other words, this treaty does aim to establish some level of very strict, as they call it, international control, but international government is the way that I would want to put it, right? A body that all nations would have to be accountable, therefore it would be obviously an international governing body, right? That could in some way, shape, or form enforce its decrees, right? So, some sort of international body that you would actually have to have some level of accountability to. They aim to set that up via this treaty. And of course, there's numerous other things that they aim to have some level of global accountability for, things like climate change, COVID, so on and so forth. This just happens to be the thing that we're talking about right now, right? Recalling that, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, states must refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations, and that the establishment and maintenance of international peace and security are to be promoted with the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources, have agreed as follows. Okay, so the parties, recalling and desiring and noticing and blah, 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 all of the following that we have, or all of the previous garbage that we have just listened to now, right? They have agreed to what follows. But real quick, before we get into that, I would like to point something out. They say states must refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. In other words, it does seem that this document is indeed saying that some level of quote, threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of a state would be okay if it was consistent with the purposes of the United Nations. I would just like to point that out, considering the fact that we have now asked the question, how exactly are they going to plan to enforce this sort of a thing, as well as any other sort of international decrees that they make, as well as pointed to the fact that they want, quote, strict and effective international control, even within this document. Right? So just things that we want to make sure we emphasize and that you guys notice. So they have agreed to the following. Article 1. Each nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes not to transfer to any recipient, whatsoever, nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosives or devices, or control over such weapons or explosive devices directly or indirectly. Let me read that one more time. Each nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes not to transfer to any recipient whatsoever nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices or control over such weapons or explosive devices directly or indirectly. Continuing. And not in any way to assist, encourage, or induce any non-nuclear weapon state to manufacture or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices or control over such weapons or explosive devices. So, reading that one more time, I'm going to read the first sentence so it makes a little bit more sense. Each nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes not in any way to assist, encourage, or induce any nuclear weapon state or non-nuclear weapon state, to manufacture or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices or control over such weapons or explosive devices. So, reduce this into layman speak. What are they saying? Basically, that states that have nuclear weapons will try their damnedest to make sure that nobody, either directly or indirectly via their policies, achieves nuclear weapons if they have not actually yet achieved any nuclear weapons, right? Article 2. Each non-nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes not to receive the transfer from any transferor whatsoever of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices or of control over such weapons or explosive devices directly or indirectly. So, one more time. Each non-nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes not to receive the transfer from any transferor whatsoever of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices or of control over such weapons or explosive devices directly or indirectly. Continuing, not to manufacture or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices, and not to seek or receive any assistance in the manufacture of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. So, long and short here, the states which do not currently have nuclear weapons and are signing this treaty agree to not receive any sort of nuclear weapons, either directly or indirectly, right? Or nuclear explosive devices of any kind. Just one moment. Article 3. Point 1 of Article 3. Each non-nuclear state party to the treaty undertakes to accept safeguards as set forth in an agreement to be negotiated, so it doesn't exist yet. Excuse me. Let me restart that one real quick. Each non-nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes to accept safeguards as set forth in an agreement to be negotiated and concluded with the International Atomic Energy Agency in accordance with the statute of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Energy Safeguard System, Agency Safeguard System, or the exclusive purposes of verification of the fulfillment of its obligations assumed under this treaty with a view to preventing diversion of nuclear energy from peaceful uses to nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. That was kind of a run-on sentence, so let's read it one more time. Each non-nuclear weapon state party to the treaty undertakes to accept safeguards as set forth in an agreement to be negotiated and concluded with the International Atomic Energy Agency in accordance with the statute of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the agency's safeguard systems, for the exclusive purpose of verification of the fulfillment of its obligations assumed under the treaty with a view to preventing diversion of nuclear energy from peaceful uses to nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. So in other words, they are agreeing, and there's a little bit more of this point, so we're not quite done with it, but basically they are agreeing, right, that to basically safeguards to be set up not only by this negotiation that doesn't quite exist yet, right? This treaty that doesn't exist yet, but presumably to be governed by this international accountability body that doesn't quite exist yet, what we saw in Article number 1, right? Or excuse me, not in Article number 1, in the before the agrees to as follows. Excuse me, I somewhat lost my train of thought there. Basically, so they're agreeing to have this safeguard set up by this treaty and presumably governed by this non-existent body, or at least not yet existent body, to have these safeguards set up to make sure that when they do have peaceful nuclear technology, such as things like nuclear energy, nuclear reactors, things like that, that there is nothing to actually divert that nuclear power into some level of nuclear weaponry. Right. Procedures for the safeguards required by this article shall be followed with respect to source or special fissionable material, whether it is being produced, processed, or used in any principal nuclear facility or is outside any such facility. The safeguards required by this article shall be applied on all source or special fissionable material in all peaceful nuclear activities within the territory of such state, under its jurisdiction, or carried out, under its control anywhere. So they want to make sure that these safeguards are basically applied in any sort of, in any sort of technology where they're actually using nuclear power in some sort of a peaceful, non-weapons, non-martial, I should say, manner. Excuse me. Each state party to the treaty undertakes not to provide A, source or special fissionable material, or B, equipment or material especially designed or prepared for the processing, use, or production of special fissionable material to any non-nuclear weapon state for peaceful purposes, unless the source or special fissionable material shall be subject to the safeguards required by this article. In other words, they're not going to help you get any sort of nuclear technology that you might be using for peaceful purposes, such as just energy, if you will not agree to these safeguards that were previously discussed in Article 3.1. We're, of course, in Article 3.2. Point number 3. The safeguards required by this article shall be implemented in a manner designed to comply with Article 4 of this treaty, which, of course, we have not read yet, and to avoid hampering the economic or technological development of the parties or international cooperation in the field of, peaceful nuclear activities, including the international exchange of nuclear material and equipment for the processing, use, or production of nuclear material for peaceful purposes, in accordance with the provisions of this article and the principle of safeguarding set forth in the preamble of the treaty. Going to go ahead and read that one more time just to make sure we properly understand. Just one moment. The safeguards required by this article shall be implemented in a manner designed to comply with Article 4 of this treaty, and to avoid hampering the economic or technological development of the parties or international cooperation in the field of peaceful nuclear activities, including the international exchange of nuclear material and equipment for the processing, use, or production of nuclear material for peaceful purposes, in accordance with the provisions of this article and the principle of safeguarding set forth in the preamble of the treaty. So in other words, they are going to make sure that all the safeguards that they require are going to be in compliance with Article 4, which we have not read yet, and basically that there is no exceptions to this rule. I'm sorry that I'm not going too deep into like some of my thoughts on the details here that we're seeing yet. I want to conclude more towards the end so that we can actually read all the details for you guys and you know the content of this treaty here, because that's the entire purpose of tonight's episode, of course. Non-nuclear weapon states party, let me make sure. Yeah, I am at the right place. Okay. Point number 4. Non-nuclear weapon states parties to the treaty shall conclude agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency to meet the requirements of this article, either individually or together with other states in accordance with the statute of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Negotiation of such agreements shall commence within 180 days from the original entry into force of this treaty, which, if I remember correctly, is going to be January 22nd of 2021. But I digress. Back to the treaty text. For states depositing their instruments of ratification or ascension after the 180-day period, negotiation of such agreements shall commence not later than the date of such deposit. Such agreements shall enter into force not later than 18 months after the date of initiation of negotiations, which would be 1 year and 1/2 year. So 1.5 years. So basically, these are just setting up our timetables, and, making sure that they, quote, meet the requirements of this article, and make sure that they're concluding everything with this IAEA, and so on and so forth, right? A lot of important details, but I guess boring details, shall we say. Article 4, point number 1 of Article 4. Nothing in this treaty shall be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of all the parties to the treaty to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination and in conformity with Articles 1 and 2 of this treaty. One more time. Nothing in this treaty shall be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of all the parties to the treaty to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination and in conformity with Articles 1 and 2 of this treaty. So basically, they're saying you do have the right to nuclear technology, you do have the right to nuclear energy, and this in no way is trying to hamper or affect that inalienable right. Now, of course, this is just blatantly false, considering what we have already previously read, where they were saying that they were actually going to make sure that they we're not doing any business whatsoever of a nuclear nature with any nation that was trying to use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes if they did not indeed fall under the safeguards as set up by the so far not established treaty, right, that we had heard from earlier or heard about earlier. So this is just an outright lie. But nonetheless, it's one of those things that they kind of have to put in there because each nation is going to be concerned about their sovereign authority over things like their own energy capabilities. Point number 2, all the parties to this treaty undertake to facilitate and have the right to participate in the fullest possible exchange of equipment, materials, and scientific and technological information for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Parties to the treaty in a position to do so shall also cooperate in contributing alone or together with other states or international organizations to the further development of the applications of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, especially in the territories of non-nuclear weapon state party to the non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty, with due consideration for the needs of the developing areas of the world. Let's read that one more time because I kind of messed up a little bit there. All the parties to the treaty undertake to facilitate and have the right to participate in the fullest possible exchange of equipment, materials, and scientific and technological information for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Parties to the treaty in a position to do so shall cooperate in contributing alone or together with other states or international organizations to the further development of the applications of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, especially in the territories of non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty, with due consideration for the needs of the developing area of the world. Article 5. Each party to the treaty undertakes to take appropriate measures to ensure that, in accordance with this treaty, under appropriate international observation and through appropriate international procedures, potential benefits from any peaceful applications of nuclear explosions will be made available to non-nuclear weapon states parties to the treaty on a non-discrimination basis, or non-discriminatory basis, and that the charge to such parties for the explosive devices used will be as low as possible and exclude any charge for research and development. So they're sort of rigging the prices here of what you can actually do as far as selling nuclear technology used for peaceful purposes. But also, I just want to point out this particular sentence here, and I'll reread it so that we have a little bit of catch up, right? Kind of draws a lot of attention to the absurdity of this treaty in the first place. And as I kind of pointed out on Monday, it's the same thing that makes things like gun control absurd. The only people who are going to follow these laws, of course, are law-abiding people. People who are not law-abiding are obviously not going to abide by these laws. Shocker there. When we actually have a situation set up where not only are you relying on people's good nature and being law-abiding in order for this thing to work out in the first place, like you are with any law, of course, but also the nuclear technology, as well as even the explosive devices, still exists, well, obviously there's going to be people who not only are not interested in abiding by the law, but will be able to ascertain these products, I guess, for lack of a better term, right? These materials, probably be a better word. So, in other words, they're going to get it, and they're going to be able to use it against people who don't have it because they decided to abide by the law. The exact same problem, of course, that we see with gun control. And this is one of the reasons why, despite the evils of nuclear technology, in reality, mutually assured destruction is kind of the best that we have so far. What is that? Mutually assured destruction is the idea that, well, if we both have the capability to literally destroy each other, chances are we probably won't attack each other. This is actually a big part of the reason why small nations want nukes, is to protect themselves from nations like Russia, China, the United States, and so on. So far, that's the best we got to maintain peace of a nuclear nature, at least. It's certainly not going to be achieved by non-proliferation agreements that may or may not be properly enforced by international bodies who think that they have the authority to do so. But I digress. Let's go ahead and reread Article 5 here. Each party to the treaty undertakes to take appropriate measures to ensure that, in accordance with this treaty, under appropriate international observation and through appropriate international procedures, potential benefits from any peaceful applications of nuclear explosions will be made available to non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty on a non-discriminatory basis, and that the charge to such parties for the explosive devices used will be as low as possible and exclude any charge for research and development. Non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty shall be able to obtain such benefits pursuant to a special international agreement or agreements through an appropriate international body with adequate representation of non-nuclear weapon states. Negotiations on this subject shall commence as soon as possible after the treaty enters into force, which again, if I am not mistaken, is going to be January the 22nd of 2021. Non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty, so desiring, may also obtain such benefits pursuant to bilateral agreements. All right, so let's go ahead and just continue forward. We got a lot to read. I'm not sure how long I've actually been on so far. I believe 30 minutes at least? 27 minutes? All right. Anyways, continuing. Article 6. Each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. One more time. Each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. Notice that sentiment that we have there: strict and effective international control. One more time: strict and effective international control. Well, in order to be effective, it has to be enforced, obviously, right? This is the question that I have been continuously asking and will ask again. How does the United Nations plan on enforcing this treaty? Number one, how do they plan on enforcing this treaty for nations who actually do sign it, but may be dishonest or may have rogue elements of their government who aren't interested, or may have a change of power, right? Or transition of power, rather. But also, what about nations who don't sign the treaty? How do you plan on enforcing it for them, right? Well, you need to have some ability to enforce it. And of course, the way that you do that is at the point of a gun, typically. So obviously sometimes you can be at the point of like a baton or something like that, but the idea is still there. It is a violent, what do you call that? Violent coercion that gets people to actually follow laws. Unfortunately, that's just the way that humanity is. It's the way that humanity always has been. It's the way that humanity always will be, right? So if they want it to be effective, then obviously they are going to have to set up systems that are capable of punishing these people in some way when they decide to not comply. Of course, they also want them to be strict, which, that's just more of a, strict interpretation of whatever the treaty happens to be, strict interpretation of whatever their laws happen to be. We'll, of course, see what that ends up being, in the future, but there's some indication as to what it would be here now, right? Some sort of submission to this, whatever body it is that would actually control this, these systems of safeguards and things like that, submission to the safeguards themselves, some level of, giving up your sovereignty, of course, to this international body, which would probably be in some way, shape, or form related to the United Nations, so on and so forth. And we don't obviously want to get too deep into it because there's other things we want to talk about here. But the idea is obviously they are going to enforce this treaty in some way, shape, or form. And the only way you enforce something, you can take a look at this through military, you can take a look at this through cops, even through embargoes, is through making the other group uncomfortable in some way, right? Messing with their liberties in some way, potentially even being violent in some way. And that could end up being what we see. I mean, who knows? That's obviously how the United States made sure that rogue elements of what we would now call the U.S., but who wouldn't have called themselves the U.S. at the time, but how they made sure these rogue elements listened to them, right? How do we make sure that the law is enforced in the wild, wild west when we have outlaw groups and Native American tribes and so on and so forth, violating the law, violating the sanctity of our nation, so on and so forth? Well, we go and we attack them. When the Confederacy secedes, how do we make sure that they comply? We attack them, right? I'm not necessarily saying that, all instances of this are wrong, of course. But the point is clear. If you want to get somebody to comply and they are not complying, you have to use force of some kind. Article 7. Nothing in this treaty affects the rights of any groups of states to conclude regional treaties in order to assure the total absence of nuclear weapons in their respective territories. So basically, they want you to know that this isn't going to affect, nuclear disarmament treaties that already exist. Article 8. Point number 1 of Article 8. Any party to the treaty may propose amendments to this treaty. The text of any proposed amendment shall be submitted to the depository governments, which shall circulate it to the parties of the treaty. To all parties to the treaty, Thereupon, if requested to do so by 1/3 or more of the parties to the treaty, the depository governments shall convene a conference to which they shall invite all the parties to the treaty to consider such an amendment. Point number 2. Any amendment to this treaty must be approved by a majority of the votes of all the parties to the treaty, including the votes of all nuclear weapon states parties to the treaty and all other parties which, on the date the amendment is circulated, are members of the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The amendment shall enter into force for each party that deposits its instruments of ratification of the amendment upon the deposit of such instruments of ratification by a majority of all the parties, including the instruments of ratification of all nuclear weapon states parties to the treaty and all other parties which, on the date the amendment is circulated, are members of the Boards of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Thereafter, it shall enter into force for any other party upon the deposit of its instruments of ratification of the amendment. 5 years after the entry into force of this treaty, so if I'm doing my math correctly, that would be January 22nd, 2026. 5 years after the entry into force of this treaty, a conference of parties to the treaty shall be held in Geneva, Switzerland, in order to review the operation of this treaty with a view to assuring that the purposes of the preamble and the provisions of the treaty are being realized. One more time. 5 years after the entry into force of this treaty, a conference of parties to the treaty shall be held in Geneva, Switzerland, in order to review the operation of this treaty with a view to assuring that the purposes of the preamble and the provisions of the treaty are being realized. Note this in your calendar, friends. That would be January 22nd, 2026. This goes into effect January 22nd, 2021. 5 years after that, of course, January 22nd, 2026. At intervals of 5 years thereafter, so every 5 years, a majority of the parties to the treaty may obtain by submitting a proposal to this effect to the depository governments. The convening of further conferences with the same objective of reviewing the operations of this treaty. So they just go ahead and continue with that, basically. Article number, I think it's 8, right? I don't know. I'm losing track. No, 9. We're on article number 9. This treaty, point number 1 of article number 9, this treaty shall be open to all states for signature. Any state which does not sign the treaty before its entry into force in accordance with paragraph 3 of this article may accede to it at any time. This treaty shall be subject to ratification by signatory states. Instruments of ratification and instruments of accession shall be deposited with the governments of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the United States of America, which are hereby designated the depository governments. Now, of course, I don't understand why exactly they want to word it that way, considering the fact that it is now Russia and not the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But whatever, I guess. That's certainly pretty interesting. Probably has something to do with the fact that it was signed at a certain point in time, or maybe that the USSR is what Russia was when they actually got the ability to. I don't know. That's weird. Anyways, point number 3. This treaty shall enter into force after its ratification by the states, the governments of which are designated depositories of the treaty, and 40 other states signatory to this treaty, and the deposit of their instruments of ratification. For the purposes of the treaty, a nuclear weapon state is one which had manufactured and exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device prior to January 1st of 1967. So they're obviously being pretty lenient with this, right? And that's an interesting thing for them, of course, because that would actually mean certain states are exempt from this. Now, I don't know if perhaps they're touching this up for when they actually decide to release it, right? Because who knows when exactly this thing was penned. What we know is that they want to put it into effect in January of next year. But, it's just as a perfect example of this, right? When they say they want to internationalize Jerusalem, right? And that actually was penned in 1947. That may be put into effect in 2035. Who knows, right? So maybe it has something to do with that there. But that would actually exclude nations like North Korea, Israel, and so on. So I imagine they'll probably touch this sort of a thing up, though I also highly, highly doubt that any group associated with North Korea is, or any nation rather associated with North Korea, including, of course, North Korea, would actually be signing any sort of a treaty like this. Just one moment. Yeah, so I just wanted to double check on this. So yeah, it was penned originally in 1967. That is why, and they're just wanting to have it go into effect as of January 2021. So there we go. Now we know why we have that little weird note there. This treaty shall enter into force after its ratification by the states. Already read that. For states whose instruments of ratification or accession are deposited subsequent to the entry into force of this treaty, it shall enter into force on the date of the deposit of their instruments of ratification or accession. The depository government shall promptly inform all signatories and acceding states to the date of each signature, the date of deposits of each instrument of ratification or of accession, and the date of the entry into force of this treaty, and the date of recipients of any requests for convening a conference or other notices. Point number 6, this treaty shall be registered by the depository governments pursuant to Article 102 of the Charter of the United Nations. All righty. So just one moment here. I got to fix something because I'm having a small problem. You guys actually cannot see it, but I can. So just a second. All right, just want to make sure. Can you guys actually hear me? I have a small bit of a issue here, but that is certainly all right. All right, sorry about that. I think everything is working here. Anyways. So, Article 10. Ooh, my apologies. Article 10 here. Oh, shoot. Man, I'm just messing all up here right in the middle of my show. That's all right. Each party shall, in exercising its national sovereignty, have the right to withdraw from this treaty if it decides that extraordinary events related to the subject matter of this treaty have jeopardized the supreme interest of its country. It shall give notice of such withdrawal, to all other parties of the treaty and to the United Nations Security Council 3 months in advance. Such notice shall include a Such notice shall include a statement of the extraordinary events it regards as having jeopardized its supreme interest. Sorry, my attention is slightly elsewhere because of that previous issue. But nonetheless, we continue. 25 years after the entry into force of the treaty, a conference shall be convened to decide whether the treaty shall continue in force indefinitely or shall be extended for an additional fixed period or periods. The decision shall be taken by a majority of the parties to the treaty. And there we end there. Let's move on to article number 11, and then we'll be finished. So, this treaty, the English, Russian, French, Spanish, and Chinese texts of which are equally authentic, shall be deposited in the archives of the depository governments. Duly certified copies of this treaty shall be transmitted by the depository governments to the governments of the signatory and acceding states. In witness thereof, the undersigned, duly authorized, have signed this treaty. By the way, they have a little note here, May 11th, 1995, in accordance with Article 10, Paragraph 2, the Review and Extension Conference of the parties to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons decided that the treaty should continue in force indefinitely. And of course, now, and as it turns out, since it would be actually, even though it was all put forward and debated from 65 to 68, it was actually they had their first vote here on it. Appears to be in 1970. So 50 years after that is now 2020, which also happens to be the 75th year anniversary of the United Nations. And now they're planning to actually have it go into full effect, I guess, here in 2021. It is kind of weird how it actually took this long for everything to come into play. But of course, they're going to run into the same problems now that they did back then, which is the same problems that I've been bringing up, namely, how do you enforce this sort of a thing? But nonetheless, now you guys have read it. You know what it's about. When everybody talks about, oh, we're going to be banning nuclear weapons in 2021, this is the treaty that they are referring to. Specifically, they are referring to a sort of a re-ratification of this particular treaty. But nonetheless, now you know. Here we are. Let's continue. Got to change my banner there because we now have another government document to read. Isn't this just the most exciting show on YouTube? Reading government documents verbatim. And of course, making little tiny mistakes that we don't even notice until in the middle of the show that cause extreme awkwardness. Just the greatest show ever. Anyways, as promised, We are going to read the joint statement of the U.S., Sudan, and Israel. Sudan is the third Muslim majority Arab majority, Muslim majority nation that has said it wants to actually sign some sort of an agreement with Israel to normalize relations and make peace. Sudan is a much bigger deal than the UAE or Bahrain, because even though those happen to be important Gulf states, Sudan has actually actively fought Israel before. Neither of those previous countries did. So for symbolic reasons, it certainly is important that Israel made peace with the UAE and with Bahrain. But for actual pragmatic reasons, there's a lot of importance behind making peace with Sudan. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and read this document here. It's a very short one, so won't be having to go too deep into it. And then if we have some time, I want to talk a little bit about the riots as well that have plagued Philly. So we'll see whether or not we actually get to do that. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and jump right into reading this. Joint statement of the United States, the Republic of Sudan, and the State of Israel. This is from whitehouse.gov. President Donald J. Trump, Sudanese chairman of the Sovereignty Council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke today to discuss Sudan's historic progress towards democracy and opportunities to advance peace in the region. Today, in the context of this particular article, is October 23rd of 2020, just so everybody is aware. By the way, I want to point out, I just saw Brother Nicholas's comment saying that this is an exciting show because this is real life stuff that is incredibly interesting. Being entertained by fiction is rather pointless, and I really no longer even understand how that is entertaining. I must say, I'm not quite to that level yet, Brother Nicholas, but I greatly, greatly agree. And as a result, of course, that is why I study this stuff, right? I mean, this kind of stuff is important. This kind of stuff will end up having serious impact on our lives, potentially, on the policies of our nation. A lot of times on, whether or not we'll be able to speak freely on weapons, have, respect for our United States Constitution, worship in a proper way, so on and so forth. But nonetheless, I digress. Let's get back into this. After decades of living under a brutal dictatorship, the people of Sudan are finally taking charge. The Sudanese transitional government has demonstrated its courage and commitment to combating terrorism, building its democratic institutions, and improving its relations with its neighbors. In light of this historic progress and following President Trump's decision to remove Sudan from the state sponsors of terrorism list, the United States and Israel agreed to partner with Sudan in its new start and ensure that it is fully integrated with the international community, into the international community. The United States will take steps to restore Sudan's sovereign immunity and to engage in international partners, let me restart that whole sentence. The United States will take steps to restore Sudan's sovereign immunity and to engage its international partners to reduce Sudan's debt burdens, including advancing discussions on debt forgiveness consistent with the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. The United States and Israel also committed to working with their partners to support the people of Sudan in strengthening their democracy, improving food security, countering terrorism and extremism, and tapping into their economic potential. The leaders agreed to the normalization of relations between Sudan and Israel and to end the state of belligerence between their nations. In addition, the leaders agreed to begin economic and trade relations with an initial focus on agriculture. The leaders also agreed that delegations will meet in the coming weeks to negotiate agreements of cooperation in those areas, as well as in agriculture, technology, aviation, migration issues, and other areas for the benefit of the two peoples. The leaders also resolved to work together to build a better future and advance the cause of peace in the region. This move will improve regional security and unlock new opportunities for the people of Sudan, Israel, the Middle East, and Africa. This historic agreement is a testament to the bold and visionary approach of the four leaders. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Chairman al-Burhan, Prime Minister Hamdok, expressed their appreciation for President Trump for his pragmatic and unique approach to ending old conflicts and building a future of peace and opportunity for all the people of the region. I'm interested. I'm very interested. Actually, I'll have to reread it again because I can't recall off the top of my head if it's just similar language or verbatim language, but it seems like their appreciation for Trump there is almost verbatim the same as what we saw in the Abraham Accords, but I digress on that. There you have that joint statement there. This is all we have, at least that I've been able to find so far, of the of the Israel and Sudan peace agreements. We don't actually have their full-fledged agreement quite yet. Of course, I have no doubt that we'll have that available to us sometime here soon. But at the moment, we have this information, and so I figured we should be reading it to you guys so that you are aware of what's going on. So, we have one last piece of news to discuss for today. Get a new banner there for you guys. Fatal police shooting of Walter Wallace Jr. prompts heated overnight protests in West Philly. One more time, this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Fatal police shooting of Walter Wallace Jr. prompts heated overnight protests in West Philly. This is from October 27th, 2020, which was yesterday. Brief context for those of you who do not know, there is more riots going on. And they are currently going on. In Philadelphia. Of course, I guess the question at this point is, where are they not occurring? Right? It seems Portland and DC and Atlanta and Chicago and Kenosha and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and etc. is having riots at the moment, right? But nonetheless, let's go ahead and read into this. We've basically used all of our time in the last 2 weeks discussing international politics, with the exception of discussing a little bit of Amy Coney Barrett. So let's go ahead and get right into this. Just a moment. All right, so police officers fatally shot a 27-year-old black man armed with a knife during a confrontation Monday afternoon in West Philadelphia, an incident that quickly raised tensions in the neighborhood and sparked a standoff that lasted deep into the night. Late Monday into early Tuesday, police struggled to respond to vandalism and looting along the commercial corridor of 52nd Street, an area that was the scene of clashes between police and protesters earlier this summer, of course, when we had all of the George Floyd things going on. At least one police vehicle was set on fire Monday night and destroyed. So here's some related stories, by the way, to give you an idea of what the Philadelphia Inquirer is saying about this issue. Walter Wallace Jr., 27, a family man with many mental health crises and encounters with the police. The police killing of Walter Wallace Jr. feels far too familiar to a weary West Philly community. Philly police had been called many times to Walter Wallace Jr.'s house, sources say, sparking questions about why he was shot. Now, of course, the reason why he was shot is because he was dangerous. He had a knife. He was attacking people. And the police reasonably made the decision that he was a threat not only to their lives, but to the lives of citizens around them. I am obviously not pleased with the fact that Walter Wallace Jr. is deceased. I'm not pleased with the fact that any of this occurred in any way, shape, or form. However, we do need to understand, and I say this as somebody who is very strongly opposed to police brutality and who thinks there is a police brutality issue in this country. We have to understand the difference between legitimate shootings and non-legitimate shootings. This is not something that has ever been controversial. All of the sudden in 2020, it is, right? Nobody was saying that this would be not justified 20 years ago, right? Or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. But now all of a sudden, this is a problem. Why does this keep doing this? Come on, man. Anyways, though, let's go ahead and continue. By morning, an officer was hospitalized in stable condition with a broken leg after being struck by a pickup truck, police said. About 29 other officers suffered mostly minor injuries from being struck by rocks, bricks, and other projectiles, police said in a preliminary report. So a total of 30 officers so far have been injured in the riots, and it seems like the worst of those is this officer who I guess has a broken leg being hit by a truck. I mean, that's pretty intense. Authorities detained 10 people overnight near 55th and Pine Street, police said, and those people were set to be released pending possible charges of assaulting police or rioting. Police said officers arrested about 20 people in relation to looting at various stores in West Philadelphia, University City, Overbrook Park, and Center City, some of which were not near the protest. Six law enforcement vehicles were also vandalized, police said. Hours earlier, shortly before 4 p.m., police said 2 officers responded to the 6100 block of Locust Street after a report of a man with a knife. Family members identified him as Walter Wallace Jr. A video posted on social media showed Wallace walking toward the officers and police backing away. The video swings briefly out of view at the moment the gunfire erupts, but he appeared to be multiple feet from them when they fired numerous shots. I would just like to point out how deceptive that is. Multiple feet. Like, do you realize that 2 feet is multiple feet? 3 feet, 1 yard is multiple feet. I mean, like, that's just such a dishonest way to report on the issue. And I'm going to let you guys decide for yourselves, of course, because that's the way that we do it here, right? Not that I would actually have any serious power to make you decide what I wanted you to decide, right? But isn't this an absolutely ridiculously dishonest way to report on this issue, multiple feet away? What is it? There's a 21-foot rule, I believe, that somebody who has a knife can clear 21 feet in the time it takes you to pull out a gun and fire. And of course, that's not even guaranteeing that you do it accurately or anything of that nature. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. By the way, I'm going to go ahead and actually show you guys the video so that you will be able to literally decide for yourselves whether or not you think this was a justified shooting. But nonetheless, we continue. Police spokesperson Sergeant Eric Grip said the officers had ordered Wallace to drop the weapon, and he advanced towards the officers. Grip said investigators are reviewing footage of what happened. Both officers were wearing body cameras. He said both officers fired several times. After the man was shot, he fell to the ground, and Grip said one of the officers drove him to Penn Presbyterian Medical Center, where he died. Walter Wallace Sr., the man's father, said his son appeared to have been shot 10 times. Quote, why didn't they use a taser, end quote, the senior Wallace asked outside a family residence on the block. Quote, his mother was trying to defuse the situation, end quote. Now, I don't mean to be abrasive with a man who has had the horrible misfortune of losing his son. I think that we can all boldly proclaim no parent should ever be alive to see their child's demise, right? Children obviously have to deal with the rough nature of watching their parents die, but that is natural. There's nothing natural about having your child ripped from you at a young age, right? And then having to live the next 20, 30, 40, however many years you end up living, knowing that, and with that fact heavy on your mind. So acknowledging that fact, though, Can we just be honest about what it is that we're talking about here? Sir, when you're talking about something akin to using a taser, when people's lives are literally on the line, right? Now, perhaps it would have been slightly better. I obviously would prefer a situation where everybody's alive. I think everyone would. But let's put you, sir, in that situation. You're being attacked by somebody who appears to be mentally unstable. That person has a knife. That person seems to be intent on killing you, or at least harming you in some way with that knife. Are you going to sit there and, let me make sure I have my taser so that I can harm this person in a way that doesn't actually kill them? Or are you, really by nature, going to go for your firearm and shoot the person in a place where you know they will be hit, such as the chest? I appeal to you, sir, that if you were in this exact same situation, there would be a man asking you, why didn't you use some sort of non-lethal force? Why didn't you run away? Why couldn't you have diffused the situation? Because his son had been killed. Because there's no way that you would be sitting here diffusing the situation. You would kill him, and you know it. Preservation of one's own life comes as naturally to them as eating does. And again, I am not pleased in any way, shape, or form that Walter Wallace, is that his name? Walter Wallace Jr.? Whatever his name is. I am not pleased that he is deceased. I am not pleased that he was shot. I am, however, going to defend the person who shot him. Okay? Unfortunately, in certain situations, people do bad things. Bad people do bad things and put good people in situations where they have to do bad things in order to stop worse things from occurring. And I'm sorry, but that is the way that it is. He said his son struggled with mental health issues and was on medication. Quote, he has mental health issues. Wallace said, why you have to gun him down, end quote. Of course, there's no way for the police officer to actually know that, right? It might appear that that's the case, but the police officer can't actually know that unless he just got all of the medical records of this person before he showed up, which of course is not feasible. And not only is it not feasible, but it's not justifiable. It would be an egregious violation of somebody's personal privacy. Right? So how are they supposed to know that, Mr. Wallace Sr.? Why is it that these police are going to be held to such a standard where they need to have precognition of this man's mental issues, as well as apparently the best self-control of all time, knowing, hey, no, we have to make sure we're a certain distance away so that we can actually hit this person in a non-lethal facet so that all of us can get home alive, right? That's just not the real world. It simply isn't. Okay? And if we're going to start living in a world where every single time a criminal is shot justifiably, we have riots all across the street, lootings, destruction of people's stores, eliminating people's ability to actually have a life because you burn down their private property and all of their savings that they put into this business is now wasted thanks to you punk. I'd just like to point that out. If this is the world that we're going to live in, then I got to be honest with you, you're kind of sort of asking for violence. And I'm not endorsing violence. I'm just simply saying there is going to be plenty of other people who don't want to live in this world, who think it is more reasonable to literally fight you than to live in this world with you. This is how civil wars happen. And I know I sound like an alarmist when I say that, but my friends, you need to study the 1830s and the 1840s and the 1850s, because it wasn't 1861 all of the sudden we're in a civil war. It was building up really since before we even had a founding of this country in 1776, building up tensions between the North and the South, tensions over slavery, tensions over tariffs, tensions over the idea of states' liberties, tensions over culture, so on and so forth, right? This is how these things occur. And it will occur in the United States, by the way. I won't go as far as to guarantee a collapse of the nation or a full-fledged side-splitting civil war. But some level of civil conflict is coming to this country. Absolutely. Something like, the IRA insurgencies in Northern Ireland or Kurdish insurgencies in Turkey. That is absolutely coming to the United States. There is no way I can personally see avoiding it. And, of course, I'm not some precognitive, soothsayer or anything like that. But that's just the way that I see it, nonetheless. One witness, Maurice Holloway, said he was on the street talking to his aunt when he saw police arrive. Wallace had a knife and was standing on the porch of his home, Holloway said, and officers immediately drew their guns. Yeah, that's kind of what you do when somebody has a knife, right? You would do the exact same thing if you were in this situation and had a firearm with somebody else who appeared to be distressed and appeared to want to hurt you, and they had a knife. You would do the exact same thing. I guarantee it. Any single one of you woke scolders who says otherwise is a liar. You are dishonest. Wallace's mother chased after him as he walked down the steps of his porch, still holding the knife, according to Holloway. His mother tried to shield Wallace and tell police he was her son. Quote, I'm yelling, put down the gun, and everyone is saying, don't shoot him, he's going to put it down, we know him, end quote, said Holloway, 35. Wallace brushed off his mother and walked behind a car before emerging again. Holloway said, quote, he turns, and then you hear the shots. Holloway said, they were too far away from him, it was too many shots, or so many shots, they say. End quote. Grip said it was unclear how many times the man was shot or where he was struck. The officers fired possibly a dozen or more times, according to an account by witnesses and family members. Police marked the crime scene with at least 13 evidence markers. Now, one thing I will definitely agree on is that police do need to be trained to be, shall we say, more efficient with their bullets. There's no reason to unload, potentially 10, 13 shots on the one person. That's kind of ridiculous. But I digress. By the way, for my Christian brethren in the audience, I know this show tends to be a little bit more secular, so there's probably some non-Christians in the audience, but for my Christian brethren in the audience, pray for Philadelphia and for Mr. Wallace and his family and for the soul of Mr. Wallace Jr., I mean. Both officers who were not publicly identified were taken off street duty pending an investigation. Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw arrived, that's a very ironic last name, arrived at the scene shortly after the incident as a crowd of neighbors yelled at police and questioned the use of force. By 6:30 p.m., police reopened the street and the crowd had largely dispersed. But dozens of protesters then gathered at Malcolm X Park at 51st and Pine Streets chanting Black Lives Matter. They marched to the police station at 55th and Pine Streets as they chanted, say his name, Walter Wallace. For hours, protesters confronted officers who stood in a line with rioting shields behind metal barricades at the station. People in the crowd could be seen throwing objects at the officers. A group also marched into University City. At least one TV news vehicle was vandalized, and police reported that windows had been broken at Chestnut Street. Between 100 and 200 people then moved to the 52nd Street Commercial District and caused considerable property damage from Market to Spruce Streets. Remember this when they say, oh, it's like 97% peaceful. 100 to 200 people, right? But I digress. Shortly before 1 a.m., a speeding black truck ran over an officer at 52nd and Walnut Street. The incident was captured on an Instagram live stream. The condition of the officer was not immediately known. The 52nd Street corridor was the scene of unrest on May 31st and early June as nationwide protests erupted over the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Protesters clashed with Philadelphia officers and set police vehicles on fire. Police responded with rubber bullets and tear gas on residential streets. Since then, the police department has forbidden the use of tear gas, which isn't necessarily the worst idea. I mean, you're not even allowed to use tear gas in warfare, so perhaps you should not be allowed to use it on your private citizens. But I digress on that. At times one day, the scene threatened to repeat. Just before midnight, someone set fire to a police vehicle on the street. Ultimately, more officers in riot gear arrived and flooded the neighborhood, dispersing the crowd. Mayor Jim Kennedy, in a statement Monday night, pledged a full investigation into the shooting that sparked the night. Quote, "My prayers are with the family and friends of Walter Wallace," end quote. He said, quote, "I have watched the video of this tragic incident, and it presents difficult questions that must be answered. I spoke tonight with Mr. Wallace's family and will continue to reach out to their concerns firsthand, to hear their concerns firsthand, and to answer their questions to the extent that I am able," end quote. Oh, also, I would like to point out, we should be praying for the officers as well, but nonetheless. Outlaw 2 said the department would conduct an inquiry, quote, "Residents have my assurance that those questions will be fully addressed by the investigation," end quote. She said, quote, "While at the scene this evening, I heard and felt the anger of the community. Everyone involved will forever be impacted. I will be leaning on what the investigation gleans to answer the many unanswered questions that exist." I will be leaning, on what the investigation gleans to answer the many unanswered questions that exist. I also plan to join the mayor in meeting with members of the community and members of Mr. Wallace's family to hear their concerns as soon as it can be scheduled, end quote. Arnett Woodall, a community organizer who lives a few blocks away, came to the scene shortly after the incident. He said he immediately saw how many evidence markers were in the street and felt it was a textbook example of excessive force. Even though he wasn't there, even though he didn't actually see the situation happen, he can tell just simply by the evidence markers that this is definitely a textbook example of excessive force. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Get this freaking joke out of here, dude. Like, is this where you guys get your opinions? From random dudes who lived a couple blocks down the road who said, "Oh, I saw a bunch of evidence markers and therefore." It's a joke. It's an absolute joke. Then he saw the video. Why not a warning shot, he asks. What kind of a stupid question is that? Would you, sir, be firing a warning shot at somebody who was charging you with a knife? No, you would not. If you tell me you would, you're a liar. And you need to repent of that, by the way, because lying is a sin. This is bogus, friends. This is absolute nonsense. Weapons grade balonium. Hogwash. Etc. Fill in the blank with some sort of description of crap. Why not a taser? Why not shot in the leg? No, you can obviously tell that none of these people have actually been in this sort of a situation. They've definitely never been soldiers. They've definitely never been cops. They definitely never had their home, vandalized or burglarized or something along those lines. These people are living so privileged in their ivory towers with their luxurious ice creams and cakes and all their different assortments of garbage they stuff their fat faces with, right? Trying to tell you down here, "Oh, well, why didn't you shoot a warning shot, peasant? That's what I would have done." Get out of here with your crap. I'm trying really hard not to curse. I'm sorry, friends. Anyways, he said the incident shows why police must implement stronger community policing protocols and why the city should invest in town watch programs. Because apparently, spending more money is going to solve the problem. I'd just like to point that out really quick. Quote, "The city of Philadelphia can do better," end quote. That's the worst. I love it. This is just something they consistently say. Do better. Can't you just do better? Oh my God. Dude, won't you just do better? Like, I don't know. I don't have any ideas or anything, but just do better. Like, it's ridiculous. It sounds like somebody with the intelligence level of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came up with it, right? Which is, of course, why I do the Valley Girl voice. And perhaps that's the case. I mean, after all, she is a representative. I just think it's such a stupid saying that just do better. Can't you just do better? What do you mean exactly? Give me some details, sir. But of course, why would we expect that from the likes of you? Jeez. District Attorney Larry Krasner said in a statement Monday evening, quote, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office takes its obligation to try to be fair and to seek even-handed justice seriously. The Dow Special Investigations Unit responded to today's fatal shooting of a civilian by police shortly after it occurred. and has been on scene, with other Dow personnel since that time investigating. End quote. Krasner encouraged witnesses or others with information to contact the district attorney's office. Quote, in the hours and days following the shooting, we ask Philadelphians to come together to uphold people's freedom to express themselves peacefully and to reject violence of any kind, end quote. He said that obviously didn't work, but whatever. Just a moment. All right, almost done here. John McNesby, president of the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 5, said in a statement, quote, our police officers are being vilified this evening for doing their job and keeping the community safe. Completely agree. I completely agree. After being confronted by a man with a knife, we support and defend these officers as they too are traumatized by being involved in a fatal shooting. We ask the public for its patience as investigators work to gather all the facts of this tragic incident in West Philadelphia today. End quote. This was written by Aaron McCarthy for the Philadelphia Inquirer. So, I already did most of the commenting that I wanted to do on that. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share here real quick while I pull up the video I promised you guys. Because like I said, we are actually going to pull up this video so that you guys can see for yourself. Fair warning, it is graphic. It is brutal. We are going to see one of God's own creatures be murdered or be killed, I should say. Right? So if that is not something you're interested in seeing, please do turn away here now. Right? But nonetheless, for those of you who are interested in making your own decisions, I guess, on this particular matter, I have the video here for you. So without further ado, a little bit further ado. All right, here we go. All right, and they're just re-showing it at this point. So there you have it. That's the situation there. As you can see, they are clearly trying to back away. The man is clearly pursuing them with a blade. He appears to be getting aggressive about the time that they start to open fire. I will agree that it is completely unnecessary to use 10 to 13 bullets, as I said earlier. Realistically speaking, I think, one or two would suffice. But nonetheless, I digress. In the heat of the moment, sometimes these things do happen. And it's a tragic situation. I will completely agree with the people who are heartbroken for Walter Wallace Jr. because it sucks that a human being made in the image of Almighty God was gunned down today. That is a horrible, horrifying, disgusting, gut-wrenching fact. Right? That does not mean that the people who actually shot him are evil or that they were unjustified. Unfortunately, in the fallen world in which we live, these things do occur. It's a sickening fact, but it's a fact. And I think we would all do very good to understand this fact, to understand that human evil is a thing and that sometimes, unfortunately, other humans, good humans, need to do things which may appear to be evil, right? In order to stop these evil people from doing the evil things in which they do. That's just a fact. It's the world we live in. And you do not do yourself any favors, nor do you do society at all any favors when you refuse to acknowledge that fact. You just get us in situations like we're in now. And I mean, there's just nothing more you can say about that, right? I mean, here we are once again having riots over a completely and totally justified shooting. And that's not acceptable. We cannot live in a civilized society if we continue to do this. There is no civilized society when police officers and law enforcement officials cannot do their job, when they cannot enforce the law. Should we hold police officers accountable when they are corrupt, or when they're engaging in police brutality, or when they're engaging in profiling of some sort of unjust nature? Absolutely. Absolutely. However, we don't riot. We don't loot. We certainly don't force police officers to be completely handicapped in doing their job when they are attacked by a man who is clearly, violently, aggressively wielding a knife. Nonetheless, teach their own opinions in a way. We have come to the end of this program. I would like to thank everybody who is in the chat. Excuse me. I see Brother Nicholas. I see Universal Artisan. I see Flash Gordon. Shalom to all of you. Thank you very much for watching this program. Please do share this program to your friends and family. Like if you feel that it is worth it. Subscribe if you have not done so. We post episodes of the Watchdog every weekday. At least that is the theory. As well as episodes of Unapologetics, which is Christian apologetics. It is not news. It is entirely religion-based on the weekends. So if you want to keep up with any of that content, please do subscribe here. We really do appreciate that. I say we. I have this habit of saying we because when I started this channel, there were other people with me, but that's not the case anymore. So I really should stop that. Nonetheless, there's also going to be links to all of my different social media accounts in the description. So if you'd like to follow me on Parler, if you'd like to follow me on Facebook, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, obviously in the case of the Facebook, it's going to be for the page, right? In the case of the Twitter and Parler and all that, right? It's all going to be dedicated to a page for this channel. But nonetheless, you'll be able to find links to all of those in the description, where you'll also be able to find links to all of our articles used today. And as you can see there on the banner at the bottom, and as I am going to put into the live chat here, if any of you guys think that this news is worth it, if any of you guys think that this is information that needs to get out to people, I do have a Patreon, and I would greatly appreciate your support. Of course, this is free regardless, so, whatever you'd like to do. But I would obviously greatly appreciate your support. Anything that you contribute does obviously go towards helping out with this channel and towards making sure that we can actually have a constant influx of solid apologetics and solid commentary on current events. So I appreciate you guys if you're able to contribute anything. And if not, of course, I appreciate you guys watching, liking, sharing, anything that you can do to help out here to get this information out to the public. I appreciate. Nonetheless, we're done here for today. I will be back on Friday, I believe. Yeah, Friday. Next episode of the Watchdog is going to be on Friday, and that'll be the last episode for this week. We'll have other content posted to the channel. I'm going to have a video on Saturday and a video on Sunday, perhaps even 2 videos on Sunday, but those are going to be unapologetics videos. So we'll have our third and final Watchdog of the week this Friday. And yeah, that's what we got for you. I appreciate you guys. One last thing before I go, I have a question. In the face of Armageddon, my friends, ask yourselves, will you compromise?